Yeah, I think that Gordon Ryan's a specific one because in all capacities of athletic testing, he'd probably fail a lot of them, quite honestly. Like what you're doing though is that you're actually allowing the muscle to be at a dead stop, and you're trying to now take all the muscle and trying to turn all the light switches on. It's not to say that they won't get the adaptation. Keep in mind is that most of the time that soreness is coming from muscle tearing, micro tears happening, and those potassium ions that are in the muscle are being released.
If you could give a piece of advice to a brand new white belt, what would it be? All right, welcome everyone to another episode of Elbows Tight Podcast. I have a special guest today. Chase, how you doing today, man?
Good.
Awesome, dude. Thank you so much for reaching out to me and wanting to talk about this stuff. We talked a little bit about before press and record on some topics today, and I think people are going to find a lot of value in this, especially because we're going to try to base it around the beginning grappler, which is where I kind of try to make sure my message goes. And then also, a lot of people that listen to me are parents, mid 30s, 40s, hobbyists, right? So I think there'll be a lot of information that you can give them to better understand what they're supposed to be doing to prevent injuries. Because we all know that old adage that, jiu-jitsu adds 10 years to your life when you when you start training. So thank you so much for coming on the show today, man.
No, I genuinely appreciate it.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and just jump straight into a backstory of who you are and how you got into jiu-jitsu and everything, and a little bit of like your education so people know.
Yeah, for sure. Funny enough, I started jiu-jitsu years ago, back when I was in high school. So it started out when I was doing like typical martial arts, you can say, like for self-defense purposes. So like working with stick fighting, learning how to just defend yourself on the street. And long behold, our professor from another type of martial art ended up bringing in a bunch of Brazilians in one day, and they ended up teaching us jiu-jitsu. I had no idea what it was at the time, but they taught us everything for, I'd say, like 2 or 3 months. And essentially they promoted a couple people fairly quickly, and then they dipped out real quickly. So I was left to doing jiu-jitsu for a while, ended up falling out of it because there was a lot of momentum that was lost. And then I started picking it up back again after college. And I started back out with Vitor Shaolin in New York City for some time, so like 2 years or so. And then the pandemic hit, and eventually ended up leaving there and started up doing jiu-jitsu again from purple belt on to working with the Meow brothers, so Paulo and Joao Meow, and the school in Brooklyn, and was working with them for the past 2 years. And here I am today. I moved to Florida, and I'm now training with Wagner Hocha, and still probably like one of the 5 gi guys at their gym. It's completely like no gi, but I'm primarily a gi guy, but I still do a lot of no gi. And yeah, I mean, some of the accolades that I have, I mean, last year, 2023, I got Pan American champion for Master 1, as well as I got Miami double gold pretty recently as well. So I'd like to say that I'm a pretty active competitor, but I'm not as active as, say, like a full-time competitor. So a little bit about my background specifically. Like I have a degree in kinesiology. I am a certified strength and conditioning specialist. I work with athletes as well as hobbyists from all walks of life, from anywhere from, say, on one end of the spectrum, they want to focus specifically on jiu-jitsu. Sometimes they want to just work on sport. Sometimes they're on the sport of life. So it really all depends there. And I have a huge focus on, say, like specifically on not just the rehab side, but just helping build energy systems and helping them just work through any sort of kinks that they can potentially have. As well, I'm also a certified functional range conditioning specialist, so work on mobility as well and have a huge focus on that. So I hope that helps out with a bit of a general start, and happy to go deeper from there.
No, I think that's great. I always forget to ask the question of like people's backgrounds, because when I bring them on the show, I always try to provide value to every listener, right? In some sense. And I'm like, I've completely forgot to like validate this person on why my audience should listen to them. So that's why I was like, I gotta ask. I always gotta ask. So
sometimes that can also turn into a whole podcast in itself when you ask someone their whole background. So It depends who you ask.
Yeah. So thank you for keeping it brief and to the no. So after you got out of college and you got back into jiu-jitsu, How long after that did you start wanting to work with athletes to help them out? Was it like instantly you're like, oh man, I love this. I want to help as many people as possible. Or was there like a little bit of a grace period where you're like, oh, I think I think I have a service I could provide here?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I was working at the time, like even though I went to school for kinesiology, I ended up moving out of kinesiology because my path brought me into specifically around physical therapy. And I ended up being completely deterred by it because I was working in the field for some time and ended up seeing the types of modalities or like say the things that they were doing in like the typical physical therapy mill. And I was like, this is horrible. Like no one's getting better here. They're just pushing people through the system. Like I don't want to be a part of this. And I ended up working in tech, working
Hmm.
in say like the tech side of things for a number of years when I got back into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I mean, that's a long answer, but more or less, like when I got back into jujitsu, I I was a blue belt at the time, but I remember I was promoted through that initial time in high school where they were just pushing people through the system. I was essentially promoted from a blue belt by a purple belt. So
Oh wow.
keep that in
Yeah.
mind. And I was getting completely demolished when I went started doing jujitsu again at Vitor Shaolin. So I think I the short answer is I was just focusing completely on myself and my jujitsu and starting to get the wheel kind of turning there.
Yeah. I like what you said in there is you realize that, people were just getting pushed through. It's more of a reactive than a preventative in a lot of medicine, especially that we have today. And I feel like a lot of jujitsu practitioners see their recovery that way and their body that way is they're reactive instead of proactive. How can we switch that mindset for people, especially hobbyist beginners at home that are listening to this? How can we switch that mindset from being reactive, oh I am injured, to proactive to, hey, I can do this to prevent this injury?
Yeah, I think the simple answer is and it translates into all aspects of life, whether you're learning something, whether you're trying to learn a new skill in jujitsu, or you're just trying to be better at your work. It's all about progressive overload. So simply put, if you're in the gym and you are trying to say like improve your shoulder for something like an injury there, the simple thing is if you can't even hold yourself up for a dead hang, you have to say start where you're at and start slowly progressing from there. It's the same way with like say like you're retaining your guard, you're a white belt. You can expect to do your best against a black belt that's going to just smash right through you.
Yeah. So, what are some things that you notice when you started working with jujitsu athletes were like the most common things that people are going through?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest ones right away is low back pain. I think
Mm.
that's one of the biggest things I notice, especially guard players. And it's particularly not so much actually having to do with injury itself. It just has to do with overuse. We're not typically meant to be laying on our backs all day and moving in that manner. We're meant to be bipedal animals walking around, not so much just scooting around on our backs. So we have to make compensations there.
So how do we do that? What are some ways that if people are experiencing lower back pain, a lot of the times people are sore in places that they never expected when they start something like jujitsu, right? Because they're using parts of their bodies and muscles that haven't been activated in years. How can we prevent some of that from happening?
Yeah, I think a good point there. I think with specifically with back pain, we have to understand one, is this an actual injury? So is this harm to the body or is this actually just hurting? So there's clearly a clear distinction there. So if we just notice that it's hurting, and the way we can kind of do that is just poking into the pain. So just say, for instance, if you can't bend over, go up until a point where you start to feel a little bit of pain and start poking into it.
Mm.
And I'm not saying pump the bear so much. I want you to poke the bear a bit and see where it's kind of hurting a bit and see if it starts to give you like a little bit more percent here and there. So you may notice, like, for instance, if you're doing like an ab curl or maybe a back extension, for instance, and you notice that like I'm just throwing numbers out there, like 20%, 20% flexion, you start to feel pain. And then you go back again, you feel like at 21% flexion, you start to feel less pain. That's usually an indication you can start moving more and more as you grease the grooves. So that's like one way to start opening up or expanding the range of motion is just starting by poking into it without trying to aggressively attack it. And once you start to gain access to that range of motion, depending on whatever movement you do, it could be a deadlift, it could be a back extension, it could be a leg raise, what have you. You can pick your poison there. And once you start gaining that range of motion there, you can start to load it from there. So you can start anywhere from the point where you feel like you can't, you start to feel like massive resistance, say from anywhere, like if you do like a 10 rep range and you can do like 8 reps of that, that's probably a good way to look at it. So don't max out, but do enough where you can have a little bit more gas tank for the next set from there.
So how do antagonist muscles and like your posterior chain fall in line with this? Like, so if I have lower back pain, does that mean my core is weak, right? Like I should be working more on my core, or my my posterior chain, my glutes, my hamstrings, they're not doing the work that they're supposed to. Like where does lower back pain fall, and how to like you just mentioned?
Yeah, it's a very loaded question there because it can really depend on person to person. Everyone's anatomy is completely different. So, like, I'll give an example, not so much from a jiu-jitsu standpoint, but from like a lifting standpoint. If you take someone and tell them to do a squat, you may notice that there's going to have completely different patterns from person to person, just because structurally everyone is built completely different. There's no one size fits all form, but you have to find what works for you. And to kind of tie back to the question that you're saying, ultimately you have to just start poking into things and ultimately see, like, when I do move this, or if I move my hip in this direction and I start loading this way, does the pain go away? That's usually a good indication. But more or less, by building capacity or starting to load the back, like say the back or the core, so the core being the front and the back is ultimately the core, you're going to build more structure, or say in that case, more muscle. And when you build more muscle to support the system or the foundation, ultimately you're going to be able to cope with the stressors that come with jujitsu.
So when you talk about building muscles, are we talking about focusing on hypertrophy, or like focusing on just like overall strength than the muscle growth from that?
Yeah, I would say more or less starting with hypertrophy, because you want to build as much muscle mass as possible around the core. And it can go into more specifics depending on what you're trying to do or what the goal is. But ideally, like on a general adaptation phase or focus standpoint, you want to build some hypertrophy there, just because you want to have some muscle. And the more muscle you have, the more strength you can kind of create after that.
Yeah, one of the people I follow, Dr. Mike Israetel, right, from RP Strength. He's phenomenal. If you guys don't know who he is, he's a brown belt in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, RP Strength and Conditioning. And one of the things that he talks about a lot is not loading super heavy when you're building for hypertrophy, right? Just quick eccentrics, or quick concentric, long controlled eccentrics. Is that something that people should be focusing on as well for Jiu Jitsu?
Oh
Time
yeah,
under
for sure.
tension.
100%. And that depends on like what phase you're in. But I think that, like, from a hypertrophy standpoint, I think that is the money there. And let's say, for instance, I kind of go back to what you were saying earlier about like an injury standpoint. It's ideal to go slow on both the concentric side and the eccentric side. Like, you really don't want to just start poking through and starting to do sharp movements there. It's ideal to go with a slow tempo on both ends. So from a hypertrophy standpoint, when you're trying to grow muscle, exactly what you said. Go like sharp, or like a 1 second on the concentric on the squeeze, and on the eccentric on the release. You want to kind of create like a 4 second negative there.
Yeah, one thing that we hear a lot about in jiu-jitsu is having big muscles, isn't super great because of mobility issues, right? People get more tired because they're carrying more muscle. How do you see these things when you look at someone like, a Gordon Ryan who's huge, or all these other jiu-jitsu athletes that pretty much look like they're ready to step on stage in like 2 or 3 weeks, right? And then you hear these common people just saying like, "Oh, well, you don't want to build too much muscle because of X, Y, and Z," or you don't want your legs to be too strong because of X, Y, and Z, or whatever. How do you look at those kind of like comments?
Yeah, I think that Gordon Ryan's a specific one, because in all capacities of athletic testing, he'd probably fail a lot of them, quite honestly. If you put him against like vertical jump or anything of the like any athletic test you put him on, Gordon Ryan would probably fail. I think where Gordon Ryan really shows itself is obviously purely he's the best. He's got incredible technique, but he also knows how to squeeze or create isometric strength in the right places at the right time. So for him, like building that isometric strength has been a big factor of how his game's progressed over the time as he's grown muscle. And quite simply, like he avoids much more injury just because he has a lot more muscle on him. But I think there's a ceiling there to how much muscle you need compared to performance as well. And to your point, even with like Mike Israetel, and he would probably agree with this, is that the more you do certain exercises, like say like a squat or deadlift or like loading weight, especially on the eccentric, you're actually not only building muscle, but you're actually building more range of motion as well. So you're actually creating more flexibility in that range. If you do a full range of motion rep, not one of those partial reps when you're kind of just trying to ego lift or whatnot, but going through full range of motion and not trying to lift as hard as you need to.
Yeah, I saw a recent guy talk about a study where it showed partial lifts, but in the bottom half of the partial being really good for mobility and strength and conditioning. Is that what you're that's not what you're talking about. You're talking about like the top half of a lift. So you only go halfway down with the bicep curl and then instead of the full range of motion, right?
Yeah, like I would say definitely like that. Like I would even as well, if you wanted to even go even deeper, you can do like a full set of say full range of motion squats, for instance, with no partials, nothing. And then directly after, kind of doing like an isometric hold, like loaded stretch at the bottom range. So that way you actually not only load the weight on the end range of the exercise, but you're also stretching as well.
Yeah, that's when I used to do squat every day, probably about, I don't know, 8 years ago. One thing that he has you doing in that program to build your overall squat numbers is pauses, a lot of pauses in the bottom and then driving out with no bouncing. And man, let me tell you that it sucked at the beginning, but your numbers, like your strength just like skyrocketed after like the first like 3-4 weeks. Your body was just adaptation was just through the roof.
I mean, think about it though. Like what you're doing though is that you're actually allowing the muscle to be at a dead stop, and you're trying to now take all the muscle that you've built up and trying to turn all the light switches on. And when I say the light switches, there's muscle and then there's a nerve that innervates the muscle. So not all the muscle that you build from hypertrophy has strong innervations into those muscles to then activate. The difference there is that when you create that pause, you're removing some of the other factors like elasticity in the joints and the muscles from bouncing you back up and the momentum carrying you. You're at a dead stop. You're at the full end range of motion. And now you're fully relying on your nervous system to then turn on the muscles to then bring you back up. So you're 100% going to create an adaptation there.
Real quick, this episode is brought to you by our Patreon and YouTube members. Thank you guys so much for committing $5 a month for exclusive and early content, and you get priority Q&A, and you will get secret live streams, and also you have the opportunity to get your roles reviewed by myself and a past guest or one of my high-level friends that can tell you what you're doing wrong, what your goals are, and where you should be focusing. Also, you are directly supporting the podcast and allowing me to keep improving and keeping my editor Dan. So thank you guys so much to my patrons and to the YouTube memberships. If you guys want to join for $5 a month, link is down below. Thank you so much. Back to the show. Peace. So let's talk a little bit about isometric movements and what are some. So I hear in strength and conditioning when it comes to like jiu-jitsu athletes, and Chad Wesley Smith has talked about this when I talked to him, was like, and I would love to get your point of view on it, is for jiu-jitsu movements, they don't have to replicate exactly what we do in jiu-jitsu for strength and conditioning. You know what I'm saying? Like, so for isometric movements, how do you feel about like ball squeezes and, you know, these pull-ups with like holding onto a gi or whatever, like these movements that are supposed to mimic what we do in jiu-jitsu for strength and conditioning?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. So it goes back to my thinking about like energy systems and how we have to separate what we do in the gym to what we do on the mats. That's the kind of like high level. To kind of point to your answer, I think the ball squeezes are pretty good overall. You don't have to get super specific with your grips in particular. I think just activating and getting that squeeze is going to create some sort of translation into the sport. Do I think that the gi grip pull up holds are going to help? There's a lot of studies that show that grip specificity doesn't actually help with, say, like grip strength when you're doing your pull up holds, for instance. So you don't really need the gi. You don't need some sort of towel to be there in order to actually build your grip strength and like the actual like isometric pulling strength. So up to you. Pick your poison there as well. If you want to do the gi, great. If you don't, do what you want.
You mentioned in there energy systems. Like what do you what do you mean? Like what's the definition of energy systems and what are the different ones that we should be working on for jiu-jitsu athletes? Not high level athletes, but like for the most people that are going to be listening to this, like the jiu-jitsu hobbyist that trains 3-4 times a week and probably has a day job, sits at a desk quite a bit.
Yeah, I understand that. So you have like a couple different systems, and you can kind of see how different sport athletes typically use them. So you have one, which is a PCR creatine system. So it's just like the first 10 seconds of like a very explosive exercise. So think of like a Olympic athlete pulling a weight off the floor in like seconds. So that's the PCR creatine system, and it cycles in with it takes a very long time to recover. So you may see when you do like a super heavy lift, you have to rest for a long time because it takes a while, but it's super fast acting and it activates very fast. Then you have the anaerobic system, which is quite what it sounds like. So without oxygen. So when you get that burn in your muscle, uh, basically like with the muscle activating to really activate strength in order to elicit a movement of weight. I think that's kind of a simple way to put it. And then aerobic is kind of like anything beyond like 2.5 minutes from there. Uh, Not super high intensity, but being able to prolong long periods of time of endurance at that point. And there's a lot more specifics with it, depending on like alactic, lactic. We don't have to go too crazy into it personally, but like I think at a high level, you have PCR, creatine, you have anaerobic, and then you have aerobic.
So how can we train and how important is that PCR energy system for like a jiu-jitsu athlete?
Yeah, I'd say like the PCR creatine is like less likely to be used because you can guess that out fairly quickly. You want to focus more on like working within fatigue as well as building up as much strength and power as possible. And power is not so much of an energy system, but it's more or less like the light switch being able to activate to get the muscles moving as fast as possible.
So strength or for conditioning, we a lot of people want to do, conditioning outside of just rolling, but sport specific conditioning is always going to be the best way to do it, right? So if you want to get better, last longer in rolls, then you should probably just start rolling more, right?
I actually
Like,
have a I have a whole thing about this. It's so funny you bring up in terms of like conditioning. I feel like a lot of people that they'll put themselves on an assault bike or whatnot to condition themselves, but it doesn't exactly translate well to jujitsu. And I found a lot of athletes with the same way. What I do find, and I've actually seen a number of athletes like say like Volkanovski, for instance, and like all the Aussie guys and even the Dagestani MMA fighters, what they'll do is that they'll put themselves in a incredibly fatigued state. It can be anything that they choose from. Like they'll put themselves in a room with say like Volkanovski, that they call it a spider, and they'll have Volkanovski in the middle, and every 30 seconds, kind of similar to a Shark Tank, they'll have someone in the new coming at him, and he's just doing takedowns nonstop, just
mm.
takedown nonstop, and the guy just giving him the body, and he's just taking down, and then the next 30 seconds just doing ground and pound from there. And I basically took that and realized this is no different than jujitsu. You have to be able to put the athlete in the situation where hell becomes their home in that way. and you have to put them in a constant fatigue state. So when they're at the last minute of a round, they're able to still keep going and push through that.
Yeah, that's one thing I know I struggle with is if I get, 2 or 3 rounds in, that 4th round, maybe even that 3rd round, I'm like gassed already, man. Like, and I know that those are the most important rounds because it's gonna build that conditioning for me. But do you have any tips like how like, to stop that from happening or how to better work with that? Because it is I'll be rolling with someone that, I usually don't have too hard of a time with and I'm so exhausted. I'm fighting for my life on the mats, you know what I mean?
Like what you're doing though is that you're actually allowing the muscle to be at a dead stop, and you're trying to now take all the muscle that you've built up and trying to turn all the light switches on. And he'll get his win. I don't really care because I'm in the lab trying to work. But at a high level, the way I would probably approach it is, if let's say you're a hobbyist and you're going to jujitsu 3 days a week right now, approach to those classes with the intention of primarily skill acquisition. So definitely not trying to go 100%. Put yourself in scenarios that you're not used to and trying to work out of them. And then one day of the week where you're just working rounds just for cardio, that Pujada time, like you want to just put the gas on it. And you know that you're not learning anything, but you're just focused on performance. But what I would probably say there, when you're on that 3rd round and you're starting to get gassed out, is first of all, try to do some nasal breathing, try to calm your nervous system down a bit, understanding that you have to start feeling your body out and realize that you might be tensing up way more than you realize. Especially as a white belt, you might realize that one of the biggest factors that makes a black belt different from a white belt is their ability to relax in a tense and pressured environment. So learning how to just take a step back and realize that this is not the end of the world and relax. And usually when I say relax, does not mean understimulated, but trying to be in optimal state zone. Because usually most of the time people are overly stimulated. They're hyper like tensed. That's one. Two is that try to see, like, if you notice that you're already like kind of gassing out a bit, try to see if you can keep moving. And that means like another 10 or so seconds, 20 seconds. The same thing I mentioned before, progressive overload. If you notice that you're already like at the cusp of it, and this is usually the point where you start to gas out like completely and you're done, see if you can get like another 10 seconds in and see what you can do from there. You may notice that you may still have some more in the tank than you realize. Maybe you're still gassed out, but you're still moving. And your body will make the adaptations from there.
Yeah, I noticed when I was like big into CrossFit and all the time and whatnot, I would feel, and this is like to your point, I would feel gas during the entire workout. And then the last 10, 15 seconds will kick in. I'm like, all right, I gotta really just gas myself out for this last little bit and give it everything I can. And I would be like, well, was that worth it? Like, because if I had that much energy left, does that mean like the rest of my workout, I wasn't pushing as hard as I was? Like, does that ever go through your mind?
Well, you can't push that. You can't push 100% all the time. It kind of goes back to the whole like anaerobic and aerobic kind of scenario, or the PCR. If I was expecting to do like a huge, if I was on the bottom and I was expecting to lift the guy off of me, I can't imagine to do that for an entire 5-minute round of just lifting this guy off of me over and over again. Most of the time, most of the round is on an aerobic kind of endurance state. And then maybe like the last 20 or so seconds, you're probably in a bit more fatigue just from all the cardio that you were just doing. But now you're just trying to put it into overdrive and really just crank up the power and just trying to get some movement or some space between you and the opponent. So that way you can probably sweep or submit or just get an opportunity to get an advantage there.
So how do you train or how do you feel about the different zones for aerobic activity, right? Like zone 2 and 3, like long distance running. I have a friend who's our academy owner. He's a brown belt and he recently started running ultra marathons and he says his rounds feel like so much better. Like he doesn't nearly get gassed as much and whatnot. He's also he's always been a high level athlete too. So how do you feel about like zone 2 and 3 training for jiu-jitsu athletes? Do you feel it's pointless or is it anything that to get you moving is good?
Yeah, I think anything that's going to get you moving is ultimately going to work, more or less. I don't know if I really believe whether zone two or zone three, there's like an optimal zone to like really get you going, especially with the dynamics of jujitsu. Like you can't really zone two, zone three jujitsu when all of a sudden this guy is just moving like he goes from 0 to 100 out of nowhere and he's just moving around you. So there's nothing that really sets you up for that outside of the jujitsu environment for cardio. So ultimately, I definitely do find that if you have a focus when you come into jujitsu, whether you're a white belt, blue belt, etc., have a have a thought in the back of your mind like I'm just going to focus entirely on just performing and just getting my heart moving from there. And if that means that, and also picking your rounds too, and being smart about it. If you know the guys in front of you is gonna just lay on top of you, use that to your advantage and learn how to just move from side to side and use that. If you know a guy is like really small but very agile, learn to move around that as well. It's a loaded question because it really depends on the person in front of you and how you approach it. You can be like a really big heavyweight and you're working with a lot of heavyweights. You probably don't need crazy cardio for that all the time or being super fast because everyone moves slow. You can be small and you have everyone moving around you super fast. So you got to be very much explosive and always constantly moving. So just I think the short answer is take a look at yourself in the mirror, understand, am I strong and big or am I super small? And is this a limiting factor for me to get gassed out fast? And I'm small, fine. I'll start to work cardio. If I'm big and I'm gassing out, maybe I need to work cardio as well.
Gotcha. So a lot of people that start jujitsu as beginners, it's their they're not athletes, right? They're doing it because they saw MMA or they want to do self defense or you know what I mean. It's their first martial art and first time being very active. And one thing that you always hear is, "Oh man, I don't want to start jujitsu until I'm in shape," or I don't want to do that because my body has X, Y, and Z injuries or whatever." But how do you convince athletes that you don't have to be in perfect condition to start jujitsu? Because I mean, I tell them all the time, like your body will adapt to jujitsu. Like it doesn't matter. I was in phenomenal shape when I first started jujitsu. I was like 26, 27 years old. Uh, Olympic weightlifter, lots of CrossFit, great conditioning. I got on the mats for the first time for 5 minutes and I thought I was going to die, right? Like it was a completely different thing. And that really opened my eyes. Like there is no being in shape for jujitsu.
Yeah, I think that you're 100% right. And it ties into everything we're saying before. Like, there's no specific exercise workout that's going to prepare you for jujitsu besides jujitsu in that way. But simply put, like, you just have to kind of put yourself in there and don't beat yourself up over the fact that you may not be able to go super far with it. Like, and this is definitely hard for white belts to do or beginners to not go balls to the wall. But go with the idea of with the focus of learning and not about trying to like muscle your way through or gassing out. Focus with if you go in with the idea of learning, the cardio and all that stuff will start to come through much more than ever. And of course, evaluating the school that you're going to as well and talking to your professor and saying, hey, like if you notice that you're gassing out super quickly, talk to your professor about that and ask him tidbits on that. He may say if you really want to get better in that, he may throw you another round or two, or who knows, over time, he may put you in a shark tank. They suck, but that's where you get better. The places where they suck the most is where you're gonna get better.
So if people want to start strength conditioning and working on their condition or strength conditioning and start working on that when they start jujitsu, how can they implement it into their training without hindering their ability to get back on the mats and then also injuring themselves because they're inexperienced or something like that in the lifting aspect? Like, how can people navigate that line of I want to train jujitsu and I want to do strength conditioning to get better at jujitsu? You know what I mean?
No, I definitely understand what you mean. I would say with my overall theme is always starting small. So if and it also depends on how much time you have allocated. Like you can be someone that has a family, you have a very demanding job, and Jiu-Jitsu is already taking a lot of your time. I would say start super small. If that means like if you have a single kettlebell in your house and you just do a couple reps of that when you wake up first thing in the morning or whatever time you can fit in, so be it. If you have the extra time to maybe even fit a single session throughout your week to do strength and conditioning program, that's perfectly fine as well. Ideally, like a lot of athletes that I would work with, I'd probably put them anywhere between 2 to 3 days a week of strength and conditioning. So if you're able to fit in, say, like 3 days a week of jujitsu and 3 days a week of strength and conditioning, great. If you're able to do 1 day a week or 30 minutes, so be it. Like you can actually get us a crazy amount of results still and not get injury from that. So that's one high level, anywhere between, let's say, 1 to 3 days. Two is that you want to work within a range where you have a little bit extra gas in the tank when you're lifting weights. So, kind of like what I was saying before, if you're doing a 10 rep exercise, like you ideally want to be anywhere between the 7 to 8 rep max range. So that way you have a little bit more gas in the tank from there.
That's
So
called a
so the other
RPE,
way
right?
around actually is that if you do seven to 8 reps, you want to be able to do 10 reps of that. So my fault.
Yeah, RPE, right,
Yeah.
is what is commonly called.
Yeah. And the thing is with RP is that it can be difficult because like there's just ebbs and flows as well. Like
Yeah.
you can't really just be like, I'm gonna do the same weight this week, and then the next week you may be just gassed out or from jujitsu. I don't know, maybe you got to a fight with your spouse, or you just had a lot of stress from life. Like there could be a million reasons why you're feeling stress, but all that factors into volume, whether physically or mentally. So you have to be kind of sympathetic for yourself and empathetic to where you're at, and understanding that sometimes, like maybe today, if I'm doing 7 reps for 100 pounds, and next week for some reason, or 2 weeks, the next week I did 110, I felt great. And then the week after that, I did 70 pounds and I don't even know why. Just understand there's a million of factors that are going on around you that go beyond jujitsu in the gym that can affect your weight. And it's not to say that you're trying to lift heavier in the gym. You're not trying to be a bodybuilder. You're trying to learn how to cope in the gym so that way you can cope better in jiu-jitsu. Simple as that.
Exercise selection for jiu-jitsu athletes. Should they be doing heavy compound movements, back squat, deadlift, bench press, barbell movements, or should they more be focusing on single arm stuff, Bulgarian split squats, front leg elevated split squats, things like that? What kind of movements should they be focusing on?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it depends. So that's depend.
Always depends. And
It always depends.
yeah,
I typically, like with a lot of athletes though, like I'll start them out like I usually work them out in 3 phases. The first phase I'll actually do them more like unilateral, like or single arm, single leg. So that way they can kind of build a bit more of like this the imbalances that could be potentially there, and strengthen from, and there's some also stability aspects that come to it as well that maybe that come from injury. Doesn't mean that it actually translates to jujitsu and your ability to translate to be stable there. So there's a caveat. Then from there, I'd probably move in from, say, like single arm, single leg to doing like the bilateral aspects and being able to do a barbell squat or deadlift. So it can be phased out. But if you notice that you're starting to feel stronger in one leg or another, or one arm the other, probably ideally do single arms. If you feel like strength's pretty the same, you can kind of go with the barbell. Like there's no one size fits all there.
I it's funny you mention uneven strength because I always have this thought in my head. If I have an imbalance in strength from my right to left side, does that mean I should be doing more weight on the stronger side and less weight, or should I find a balance in between where they both get exercise or get a good workout in?
Yeah, I would probably do where they both get a good workout in. Just because at the end of the day, there's a threshold of a floor and a ceiling where there's general adaptation happening. The below the floor is basically like no stimulus whatsoever. It's just not enough. And above the ceiling is just jump volume. You're just stressing your body out more than it needs in that moment. So as long as you're within that range, more or less, you're going to get an adaptation on both sides.
Well, that's good to know because my wife, I told her the other day, you don't. She's like, "Oh, my left shoulder is weaker than my right. I'm gonna do more." I'm like, "No, no, just use the same." And I was like, "She's like, no, I think I would." I was like, "Come on, babe, just use the same way for both sides." So, what about movements like clean and jerks, snatches, um, jerks, just like explosive movements like that? Do they have value in jujitsu? Like, um, once again, back to Mike Here's to Tell, he had one of these videos where he kind of like joked about it, where he's all like, if I know someone that has strong isometric movements, I'm nervous if they're a good jujitsu practitioner. But if I know they deadlifted 700 pounds, I'm a lot more nervous than that for that because their body can move serious weight. So when it comes to like snatch and clean and jerks, how do you feel about those for jujitsu athletes?
Yeah, I think that they like those power movements in particular. I think that there's a bit of a loaded answer there. One is that I do think that there's an importance of doing, I guess you could say, cleans or like something similar to that. But your job as an athlete is not trying to learn how to do Olympic lifts to the most perfect degree. Like you're not becoming an Olympic athlete. And I even think back to even like some of the judo like national teams that I watch and see. They'll do similar movements that look like similar to a jerk or similar to a clean, but they're nowhere near a clean. They're just trying to move the bar as fast as possible. That's their
Mm,
clear intention there. And that's more on the power development side, trying to get all that strength to turn on as fast as possible. So that way they can move from point A or displace from point A to point B as quickly as possible. So it's not about lifting super heavy in that moment. It's finding a weight that's able to move as fast as possible. And simply such, focus on learning the skill of jujitsu, not so much the skill of becoming an Olympic athlete.
no, that's great. And you mentioned in there, trying to just move stuff as quick as possible. I see these videos of people using resistance bands to, like judo athletes will do it. They'll use resistance bands, or they'll have someone hold someone down or hold them back when they're going for like technique to throw to build resistance in the movement. Is that something that we should even be worrying about? Like doing shots with a band around our waist to build resistance against it or anything like that? Does that have any real translations to jujitsu?
I'm not a huge fan of that, honestly. Uh, and the reason why is that if it's specifically a very complex jujitsu movement or skill that you're trying to acquire or trying to train up, well, the problem with that is that when you start to add resistance to those exercises, let's say with a resistance band or someone pulling at you, your timing gets thrown off completely over time. So there was actually a study that they did a while back. I'm gonna see when I can find it, but it was with baseball players, and baseball players were like, "Hey, we want to hit the ball way harder. So what we're gonna do is we're just gonna get weighted bats, and we're just gonna swing constantly with a weighted bat." And what happened was when they would get to the games, their swing motion would completely change because of the way that they trained up with the heavy weights, a heavy weighted bat compared to an actual bat. So when I would say like keep things super general, especially with those like explosive movements or any sort of exercise on that range, keep it simply like that. But when it comes to say complex movements like jujitsu or like trying to build skill around that, the best thing you could probably do there is just have another person's body. That's really it. You don't want to really include a resistance band there. So if like for instance with like a shoot, you can have a person in front of you and you can go for the shoot and just push at their hips as a form of resistance and try to like move them forward instead of using the resistance band on your hip because now you have something else that's pulling you back and changing the timing. And the same thing with like I've seen a couple fighters and I was talking to it was a short thing when I saw like Samuel Nagai doing it recently, training up for Worlds, and I made a comment about it. He actually was willing to reach out to me about it and ask me a couple questions. And I was just giving him a little bit of advice there. I was like, hey, like, look, like, kind of like what I was saying to you, it throws off your timing completely. Uh, but I appreciate the intention. I have all respect for the guy and what he's accomplished. And his head's in the right direction. You just have to focus on the right things.
Yeah, I remember reading that study about the bat swing and how they're like, actually, you want to use a lighter bat because it was helping with their swing or something like that. There's a study that showed like weighted versus lighter bats or something like that, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. That makes me rethink a lot of what I, I know. So, but let's talk a little bit about mobility and the importance of training mobility consistently. How how important do you see training your mobility outside of jujitsu class, outside of so there's a difference between warming up and stretching, warming up, and then working on specific mobility. Where do you see the disconnect there, or where can we uh, find a line to where people realize they should be focusing more on their mobility and not just focusing on stretching for a warm up?
Yeah. So this is a very interesting topic to me, especially from an injury risk standpoint. So there's two different types of stretching. You have passive stretching and you have dynamic stretching. So that passive stretching that you would probably do, like say like lying on like a hamstring stretch or just holding a stretch in general with no movement whatsoever, that's where you're working that passive range of motion or that passive stretch. So you may notice if I take my arm here and I move my arm all the way, or take my hand, I move it all the way back here, that's my passive range of motion. Whereas, for instance, if I want to move my hand back, it doesn't go as far. So that's my mobility there. So what we want to do, for instance, the gap between passive range of motion here, right? And let's say active range of motion, this like little gap here, is the difference between you tapping and not, or in that case, being able to move out of a submission. Because if you can't activate, if I move myself here and I can't really activate my hand or like say the muscles here in this range of motion, how am I supposed to say I'm able to get out of submission? And in the same way, being able to uh, handle the demands of the pressure putting onto me that might end up in injury. So that's the difference. I'd say like one with like flexibility and mobility right away. So that's why I see it's very important to do mobility, is because you want to build mobility so that you can expand your active range of motion. So your active range of motion here to meet your passive range of motion. So if you have more active range of motion, you have more ability to move out of bad scenarios in jujitsu and the ability to reduce your risk in jujitsu injury.
So should people be I don't want to say loading at the end range of motion in stretching, but you know, should they be putting tension on their muscle at like activating their muscle, right? So they're like doing a pigeon stretch, squeezing their glutes, or pressing forward, releasing, pressing more forward, trying to push that end range of motion more. Should that's something they should be thinking about too?
Yeah, I mean, if they're scared about initially loading the stretch, the best thing you do is just simply just do a isometric in that scenario. Before you start doing like an eccentric or concentric, the precursor to that is always doing isometric. So if you're in a pigeon position and you want to work your external rotation of your hip, you can push your leg, so from knee to say your foot, into the floor, into an isometric, to help start building more range of motion or active range of motion there. And you can, once you notice that you start to feel a little bit more comfortable there, you can move yourself from like a pigeon position with your leg on a bench and like in the lunge position, and load the lunge from that like external hip uh rotation there, and start adding weight from there. And that would start to build loaded mobility.
What is a lot of people have problems inverting because of thoracic mobility, lower back pain. They're uncomfortable laying on their shoulders and head. How can people work on their mobility to fix it? Because I know that's a very common thing for a lot of beginners is they don't have the mobility to do like a Granby roll or whatever. How can people work on that to help with that situation?
Yeah, I think that simply put is just loading the spine and being able to work the same thing I was saying before, working through that full range of motion of the spine. And I have a lot of angst against like people like Stuart McGill, who's been I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he's put
Mm-mm.
out a lot of studies back in the day about keeping a neutral spine because they did studies on dead pigs and they just bent the spine over and over again and noticed that hey, if you bend your spine, it eventually like breaks, but that doesn't really apply to live humans. And it created this whole conception around you have to keep neutral spine in all positions, especially deadlift, or you're going to break your back. But funny enough, a lot of the studies show that with a slight stoop in the back or a slight bend in the back, you displace a lot of the tension off the lower back and across the entire back as well. So what I'm trying to say is that you want to be able to move the spine in every single segment of the spine through full range of motion initially. So building that one, stretching it passively, then building mobility or active stretching, and then from there loading the spine from full range of motion. And like I'll work with clients and I'll have them do a back extension, and they're not used to it because what they'll typically do is like imagine that this is their spine and
Mm-hmm.
this is the spine here. They'll just do this, kind of just hinging at the hips the entire time. Whereas I'm having them kind of go like this, curving the
Oh,
spine and then curling all the way back up. And they
yeah. If you
don't
guys aren't
realize how
seeing it at
hard that
home,
is.
can you like for people that are listening, can you kind of explain what you
Yeah.
just did with your hand?
Yeah. So what I'm doing here is I'm like kind of like creating a C all the way down with my hand and like crunching in. Like imagine like on a back extension machine, like I'm going into like fetal position, like almost like I'm trying to tuck my head in all the way
Like curling
into
up
my
into a ball?
pelvis.
Yeah.
And then what I do from there, that's full back uh, I back off extension. And now I'm going to move into back flexion by bringing almost like reversing the C on the back extension machine and trying to bring my head all the way back, all the way towards my toes. And what that's going to do is it's going to force every single segment of the spine to then load and go towards their end range of motion there on both extension and flexion of the spine. So that way, once you build that mobility, you can start loading that as well, and from there, you'll be able to reduce a lot of the back pain that could be associated with jujitsu and then build the capacity to then invert as well.
So, just real quick on that back extension part, if people are trying to build their glutes, hamstrings, don't do that. Keep the neutral spine, keep a back, your back tight, or should they focus on that as well?
I think that you should focus on that as well. I think in every single movement, if possible, if there's a way to include spinal movement without the
Mm.
risk of injury, I think it's totally possible. So, like if you're doing a deadlift, I like I mentioned before, like you definitely want to have a slight bend in your back, especially when you see like high level power lifters and they're doing that one rep max. It's impossible to keep a neutral spine when they're lifting that weight. There's going to be a slight bend in their back. In some cases as well, like it depends from person to person with the back squat. There's going to be a little bit of curve in the lower back, especially at the bottom range, and it's really hard to prevent. Um, Even when you do a bent over row, there's going to be some curling in that you need to do, and it goes back to that same point that we were saying before. If you keep a neutral spine the entire time, and you already have a sore back from doing jujitsu, you're going to end up exasperating that situation and end up overusing the low back muscles in general for compensating for the movement. And ultimately, you're going to end up injuring yourself, or just, I wouldn't even say injuring, but just hurting yourself and keeping yourself off the mats. So you want to build as much capacity as possible by using the full capacity of the spine through full range of motion. And I'm a big proponent on full range of motion just because of that, because you're moving beyond the expectations of jujitsu. So that way, when you go onto the mats for jujitsu, it becomes that much more easy.
Yeah, I if people don't have full range of motion on certain certain movements, like my old co-host had double shoulder surgery replacement, and so now he can't lift his arm too high because of like impingement or just lack of mobility in it. How can people we kind of answer this a little bit earlier, but in the means of stretching, what can they do to help rebuild that loss of mobility?
Yeah, and that's like a very specific case with like a shoulder replacement. Some of it may never ever come back.
Mm,
Like I have a
I'll let them
friend,
know.
like I have a friend that I speak with who's a very well-known jiu-jitsu practitioner. We were just talking the other day about how he had cancer in some of his shoulder stabilizers, and I told him you can't expect to have some sort of shoulder mobility there if the muscles aren't even there in the first place. Sometimes you just have to see where you're physically at. You can't force a circle into a square. If you just happen to see that you aren't that good at inverting, or you really just can't get the mobility there, and just like anything else with some people that are more flexible than others, that exists on a bell curve as well. Some people just are naturally just way more flexible, and some people are as flexible as a log. Like it just there's no in between there. Like it just happens to be that way. It's funny. One of the mentors I was like working with, who taught me a lot of these techniques for spinal care for most hybrid athletes. This guy had zero flexibility whatsoever, but all the athletes that he worked with for spinal care happened to go through all these ranges of motion, and he did it himself as well. But he knew that he couldn't go beyond a certain limit, or he'd have to work so hard to get there that it just didn't make sense. You probably wouldn't even be able to do jiu-jitsu at one point.
So, just a kind of a funny anecdote. Should people be like sweating when they're stretching? Like, is that like I know sometimes I'll stretch and I'm like, man, this is like kicking my butt right now. I used to do like Ramwad, it was like a CrossFit thing, uh app for stretching, and in some positions, dude, I'm like, dude, I'm dying over here. It's kind of like yoga, right? Like I'm just like sweating my butt off.
I don't think that there's any. I think some people are more sweaters than others. Like, like I find like myself, like I can literally just stand and exist, and I'm just sweating. Like I'm literally that meme where I'm doing jujitsu with somebody, I'm just dripping on top of that guy, just from
Yeah.
just doing like 2 minute warm ups. And some people like they can just do everything across the world, and they can run a triathlon and they're not even sweating. I don't know why. They just don't sweat like that. So I don't think that sweating should be an indication of whether the stretch is working or not. You should just be able to feel like, wow, I got more range of motion. Like I feel like I'm sitting into it more.
Should people be sore? If they're sore after stretching, is that good or bad?
I think that sometimes it can be an indication that you might be doing too much. Like soreness in itself is not an indication of growth. Sometimes the soreness can be an indication of doing too much. But it's not to say that they won't get the adaptation. Keep in mind is that most of the time that soreness is coming from muscle tearing, micro tears happening, and those potassium ions that are in the muscle are being released and are creating those soreness factors that you may be experiencing. So there's a possibility that may happen if you end up doing too much too soon. You just have to kind of put yourself there, understand that when you first start out, soreness is going to be inevitable in one way or another when you do something new. But eventually, over time, those things will start to diminish. Just like in jujitsu, when you do that first class, your entire body is absolutely annihilated. Or that even in some cases, you do jujitsu all your life and then you just go off the mat for a week and then you come back and you're like, you got hit by a Mack truck. Like
Right.
it's always like that. So just understand that there's some days you're going to be sore, some days you're not. It's not an indication of progress.
So, one of the last things I want to touch on is DOMS, delayed onset muscle soreness. Uh, how a lot of people won't be sore, obviously the day after, but the third day, right afterwards, all of a sudden, like you mentioned, they just feel like they hit that Mack truck. What causes that, and how can people prevent slash recover from it?
Yeah, I think that what causes that, like simply what I was saying before, especially when you do like that hypertrophy kind of like exercise, those eccentric movements, cause those muscles to tear on a micro level, which then releases a lot of those potassium ions into like the rest of the body, which then creates a lot of soreness in particular. It it's delayed because sometimes it just happens to be that way, more or less. Like like the body starts to heal itself. But simply such, when it comes to recovery, and it's funny because I see you all like Instagram posting up like you got to do cold plunges, you got to do sauna, you
Yeah.
got to do this, you got to do that, you got to do massage every day. All that stuff doesn't really matter. And I'm sure you've heard this probably a million times before, is simply just getting enough sleep and just eating well. So just trying to get as much protein as possible, especially like if you're doing a lot of jujitsu, you have a lot of stress in life just from life in general, like most people have. And from there, if you're doing weightlifting, you need to be able to rebuild. So sleeping well and eating well is simply going to get you there. And on top of that, is not doing too much too soon. So if you notice that you're starting to get really fried up really soon from like after a class like 2 days ago, and then you go into your next jujitsu class, and you're like, I guess this is another cardio day, I'm another Hana day. You're riding that wave, and I'm drawing with my hand right now, like kind of like a sine wave, like going up and down. What happens is like you're kind of peaking out and you're feeling great, and you have to ride that wave out as it goes down and kind of realize that you have to go a little bit easier, because if you don't, that dip goes even lower and lower. And if you end up keep continuing to do that, at one point your entire performance hinders. At one point you get injured, and then you're off the mats altogether. So it's just really important to just listen to your body sometimes. And if you realize like, hey, like today's not the day to go super hard, then go 30, 40%. I know the AOJ guys, they go 60% most of the time with their rolls. They don't even go super hard, yet they're one of the best teams in the world. So approach it in a way that you want to make sure that you are, one, feeling okay and able to handle the capacity that's in front of you, and two, just being easy on yourself. Simple as that.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that was hard for me to understand when I started doing jujitsu specific strength and conditioning was a lot of the times I don't lift heavy weights. I don't do a large maximum set. You know what I mean? I'm not pushing in that, you know, 85, 90 percentile a whole lot. And for me, that was weird because I always knew I had a good leg day if I was walking like Ric Flair after a squat set. You know what I mean? And then like that's completely not what I do now. Should people be sore, or is that should be an indicator of a good workout for jujitsu athletes, or should it, like you mentioned, be more of that? It's supplementing. It should be like 60, 70%. If you're being sore, you might be pushing it too hard.
Yeah, and it's definitely relative too. And this is like the loaded question. Sometimes you'll get sore, sometimes you won't. But I wouldn't. I think the mindset shift is that soreness is not the goal in mind. Soreness just may be a byproduct of what may be going on. I think that what you should be feeling is that dopamine release, and that like you feel like you had a good work at it more than anything else.
Perfect. Well, Chase, thank you so much for coming on the show today, man. This is a great conversation. A lot of good nuggets there. I'm sure people are gonna get offended about something or say Chase doesn't know what he's talking about. Like everyone in the strength and conditioning field, you know what I mean? Like there's always gonna be someone out there that says, well, actually, but I love the conversation, man. Thank you so much for coming on the show today, dude.
No, I genuinely appreciate the time.
Yeah. I always like to end the show with one question, and it is if you could give a piece of advice to a brand new white belt, what would it be?
Be easy on yourself. If you've ever started anything new, you're going to understand that you're just going to be bad. That's just simply with anything. But I like to use the words from Musashi Miyamoto, who is the greatest samurai of all time. And he would say it simply is that when you learn the way to do the when you learn to do the way once, it shows itself in everything. So if you can learn to do jujitsu and understand that learning something new is always the same with anything, you're going to completely suck at it altogether. But as you continue to grow and start to see opportunities and you keep showing up, the opportunities to get sweeps, submissions, advantageous positions are going to show itself over time. And with that being said as well, start small. Progressive overload is everything. So if you start small and you notice that you're doing 1 day a week and it's starting to get easy, push yourself up to say 2 days a week from there.
Perfect. Hey, if people want to follow you, work with you, where can they find you at?
So you can